All right, in this video we're going to discuss the benefits of biodiversity. So why do we care? Why do you care? What are the benefits to protecting biodiversity? Well, in this class we're going to discuss 6 major reasons why protecting biodiversity is important to mankind in general. And you see in parentheses there, you need to know these. This is not found in your book, or I think it is found to some degree in your book, but I'm not sure if they do it the same exact way we do. So make sure that you know these and understand them. This is a test question. All right, so there's 6 major reasons why we want to protect biodiversity, and the 6 that we're going to cover in this class are as follows. Agricultural and food. Number 2 is pharmaceuticals or medicines. Number 3 is recreational/ecotourism. Number 4 is aesthetic value. Number 5 is ecological services, and number 6 is intrinsic value. So this video we're going to go over these 6 things. All right, so the first one, agriculture and food. So basically the food that you eat every day originally somehow came from nature, came from biodiversity, and having a variety of food is nice. I mean, would you want to eat the same thing every day? I know that I feel bad for my dog because he pretty much has to eat the same thing every day, which is why I like to give him different things to add to his food. But no, you'd get bored. You don't want to eat the same thing every single day. So it's important to protect biodiversity because ultimately all our food originated from the wild, okay? It was the same thing that we've done with other domesticated lines of animals and species. You know, some guy was walking around out there in, I don't know, the 1600s and pulled a root out of the ground and was hungry and took a little bite off of it to see if it was edible. It turns out it was some wild carrot, and said, hey, this doesn't taste too bad, you know, and then he kept pulling him out till he came up and found like a super fat, juicy, sweet one and said, ooh, this one's really good, and took the genetics from that one and bred it to other ones and just kept breeding for those, you know, the genetics of being really thick and juicy and yummy. And so that we eventually bred it to the point where we inbreed, basically, you selectively breed and breed for certain genetics to where you get exactly what you want. So as a result of that, most of our crops these days have very low genetic diversity because we have bred out a lot of the natural diversity that nature puts in there so they can survive and made them so that they just taste really good and they're easy to digest. Now, a really good example of this is corn, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. Okay, and so you see bullet number 3 there, which I just said. This selective breeding process that we've done with our food, however, really reduces that genetic diversity in the crops and makes them very vulnerable to diseases and viruses and bacteria and whatnot. So what is the answer to this problem? Well, it turns out that if we can find native counterparts, the wild counterparts to the plants that we have crops for now, sometimes we can go back to them and add some genetic diversity to the crops that we have to ensure that they will be sustained and can continue to survive. As I said, a really good example is corn. So it wasn't too long ago, I think it was in the 1980s, that scientists discovered a wild corn plant in the hills of Mexico that they did not realize existed. It was a wild plant related to our modern corn. It's called, you can see down there at the bottom, teosinte. And you can see that it looks like corn, okay? It's got those big, broad, leafy leaves coming off the stalks, and it gets the little flower thing like corn does. And you can see the kernels even, okay? But the kernels are triangular versus on our modern day corn. They're more round and rectangular. And the teosinte doesn't really look edible, although the way they found it was that there was some wild cows up there munching on it and thought it was pretty tasty. Well, so scientists got real excited because this was a native plant, or excuse me, a wild plant that was a distant relative of corn. And it turned out when they did genetic testing on it, it was similar enough that we could breed it to our modern day corn. And also in its genetic makeup was some genes that allowed it to be immune to 7 of the most common, 9 common viruses that our corn is very susceptible to. And I don't know, you know, how often you read about corn in the news, probably not that much. But our corn is very susceptible to bacteria and viruses. It's very, very sensitive. So This is why scientists are excited, because we've now found this wild counterpart that's got immunity to 7 of these 9 viruses. If we can select out those genes, breed them into our modern day corn, it's going to make it stronger, and we're going to be able to continue to rely on it as a crop. I mean, we use corn in everything. Probably if you're sitting there snacking on something while I'm sitting here blabbing along, you are eating something that's somehow got corn or corn syrup or something in it. We also use it for fuel. Okay, we use it to make ethanol, to fuel our cars. So it's a very important one to have along, and we also use it to feed to our livestock so that you can go and have your hamburger or your chicken or whatever for dinner. So very, very important. All right, reason number 2 why biodiversity is important is pharmaceuticals. And when we say pharmaceuticals, we're basically talking drugs or medicine that benefits us. Okay, so it turns out that more than half of all the medicines that we have discovered this far, we have created, contain some derivative of a natural product that we found out there in the wild. And some examples include a drug called exenatide. I don't know how many of you have friends or family that are type 2 diabetics, or you yourself are a type 2 diabetic, but you may have heard of this drug. And it's a drug that we use in these type 2 diabetic patients, and it helps sustain and regulate their glucose levels. And it also helps them lose weight because it's sustaining those glucose levels. Well, it turns out that the synthetic form of this drug is created from a natural form, which was a protein found in the saliva of Gila monsters. Now, I have no idea how we discovered this, but somehow, somewhere along the way, somebody discovered that some molecule in Gila monster saliva had this benefit, and so we narrowed it down, we singled it out, and then we were able to synthesize it into a drug. And if we didn't have Gila monsters here, you might think, oh, what good are Gila monsters? Well, now you know. They are the reason that a lot of type 2 diabetic patients are surviving and healthy these days. Also, the second lizard pictured there at the bottom is a western fence lizard. And these guys are not found down here on the valley floor. I think you can find them up toward the top of San Jacinto. But they're interesting because they help inoculate something called Lyme's disease. Now, if you're a backpacker or you're from at all over on the East Coast or even in the Pacific Northwest, like Washington, Oregon, where I'm from, you may have heard of Lyme's disease. I grew up in a forest, basically, and, you know, we would run around and we would come in after a summer, you know, day of running around in the forest, and we'd have to do a tick check. My mom would check us over for ticks. And, you know, I had a couple pulled off me through the summer here and there. Now, ticks are parasites, okay? They are an 8-legged little parasite. They've got a teeny tiny little head, and what they do is they secrete saliva on your skin that numbs the nerve right there, and then they actually bore a little hole in your skin, latch onto a blood vessel, and they suck your blood. Now, if a wild animal, say, gets a tick infestation, they get enough ticks on them, they can suck enough blood out of them that they eventually die. But the thing is, there's one specific type of tick, a really, really tiny one called a deer tick, and they're most prevalent on deer, but they carry this thing, this Lyme's disease, and it's a very bad disease. It's basically a virus that gets in your body, and it affects your brain if you get it really badly. A friend of my mom's actually got it, and she basically had to relearn how to talk and walk, and she gets really bad vertigo. She's very sensitive to light. She's very weak and sick all the time, and it's very, very sad. It's a very bad disease. Well, somehow scientists discovered that ticks that were carrying Lyme disease, if they happened to bite a western fence lizard and suck some of their blood before biting a human or a deer or something else, they no longer were carrying or transmitting the Lyme disease. So something in the western fence lizard's blood is inoculating the Lyme disease. So scientists are studying their blood and trying to figure out what compound is in there and figure out if we can synthesize a drug to help cure Lyme disease. So again, if we didn't have western fence lizards, we wouldn't have that option. So it's really important to protect biodiversity. Some of our cancer drugs come from trees, substances found in trees. All different things out there in nature, and most of them we haven't even remotely discovered yet. So it comes down to this. If you have a question, say you have a disease and you're trying to find a cure for it, you know, if you have a question and you need to go to the library to answer it, are you going to walk into a library with only 10 books on the shelf, or are you going to want to walk into a library with 10,000 books on the shelf? You know, you're much more likely to find that answer in the library with the 10,000 books versus the library with the 10 books. So, same thing with biodiversity. If you're trying to find, you know, a natural substance that you can derive a drug off of to cure something, Are you going to find it in an area that's only got 10 different species or an area that's got 10,000? Probably you're going to have better luck with those 10,000. So really important to protect biodiversity for those potential sources of medicine. All right, number 3, recreation and ecotourism. So the idea here, recreation, is basically any kind of activity that takes place in or around nature. Fishing, hiking, camping, bird watching, all these different things take place. And ecotourism, there are people who travel around the world specifically to go see natural things around the world. I mean, I don't know how many of you, if any of you, went, but Kurt Leuschner leads an ecotourism tour at least once every year for students, and he just went to Costa Rica, so he took a group of students down to Costa Rica, and they hiked through the rainforest, and they went snorkeling, and they saw all these really cool things, and that was ecotourism. You travel to a country to see their natural flora, fauna, and experience that. So these activities generate money for the local economy in that area. For example, here in Southern California, say over the weekend you decided that you wanted to go fishing up in Big Bear. So you get all your stuff, you go up there. Well, you're going to be up there, you're going to need gas, you're probably going to get hungry, maybe you forgot your sunscreen, so you're going to go into a store, you're going to spend some money up there. You're going to need to get a permit, a parking pass. Maybe you want to rent a boat and go fishing in the middle of the lake, so then you spend money at a local boat store, and you probably need bait for your fishing pole, and all these different things. So you're spending money and you're boosting that local economy. So if we protect biodiversity, we continue to have these natural places where people can go spend time in nature. It protects people's livelihoods as well as the economy, so it's an important asset to it. So basically, in this case, biodiversity is providing us with a source of income, and so certain areas it's really important to protect that. All right, number 4 we're leading into here as aesthetic value, but before we start into that, take a look at some of these pictures. This is a giant sequoia tree, and they are found in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park, and this happens to be the largest living organism in the world. Not this particular one, but in species in general. Giant sequoias are the largest living organisms in the world. So when we talk organisms, you can't forget the plants. They are also living. They don't have a central nervous system, but they are living, growing things, and this is the biggest one that we know of in the world. So take a minute. I don't know how many of you have been to that national park. I have yet to go. I'm very excited to be able to go and take my kids to see it. But what if the only way you could ever experience something like that and see a giant sequoia was to look at an old photograph? What if it no longer existed out in the wild, something that you couldn't go see? It'd be kind of a depressing thought. And that leads us into reason number 5. Are we on 5? No, 4 here, and that's aesthetic value. So nature can be emotionally restorative, and most of you probably know this. If you get really stressed out, maybe you go outside and go for a walk, or maybe you have a place that you like to go and just kind of meditate, or lay down and take a nap and listen to the birds, or whatever. It is very healing to us. They've done lots of studies about people who have been immersed in nature versus people who spend too much time away from nature. They actually have diagnosed a disease, nature deficit disorder now. I mean, they're diagnosing diseases all the time, but this actually, they find that the less we are immersed in nature, the more stressed out and the more tense we get. I mean, if the only place that you could ever go to see wild animals was a zoo instead of sitting in your home and watching birds and, listening to them, that would be a pretty depressing place to be. What if there weren't any parks where you could, go walk around and experience some plants and the breeze and the sun? It was just all, paved over concrete buildings. It just wouldn't be a nice place to be. So having nature in our lives and protecting that biodiversity has its own value. It adds beauty to our world, it brings peace, joy, and keeps our sanity. There is actually studies done that basically if we didn't have nature, our psychological services bills, going to see your therapist or whatever because you're so stressed out, can't deal with life, would be much bigger than they already are. And also you can think of it as, it also has financial benefits just for like properties, okay? If you have a house with a really nice, beautiful view, your house is probably going to sell faster than a house that looks out over a parking lot or, into, I don't know, your neighbors or something. People like to have their yards looking nice because it adds aesthetic value. It's very pleasing to us, visually pleasing and emotionally pleasing, and it helps us to feel good. So that's kind of what aesthetic value is. All right, number 5, ecological services. This may be a new term for you, and if it is, that's totally fine. In your assignment this week, I included a video clip that kind of explains ecological services. It's a little bit of an eccentric guy, but he and his brother have a blog, and they run back and forth, and they have some pretty entertaining videos, I must say, if you ever get a chance to watch others. But he talks about ecosystem services, and these are basically services and resources that nature provides for us free of charge as long as we keep nature healthy. So when we start destroying biodiversity, we are losing these ecological services, and they cost us a lot of money. And in order to maintain those services, it takes a lot of manpower, and it also takes a lot of money. So it's something that by protecting biodiversity, we not only benefit a lot of other things, but we benefit ourselves by having nature continue to work for us. So all organisms, including humans, depend on biodiversity, and it supports a very healthy and stable ecosystem. And there are negative consequences. Now, this slide I pulled from an older PowerPoint, but it basically just gives a summary of ecosystem, what an ecosystem is. You can see that down there. But goes over some of the different types. So you can get real technical and break them apart into different areas. There's provisioning services. And these type of ecosystem services are things like our food, okay, our agriculture. All our food originally comes somewhere from nature and that biodiversity. Nature provides us with that. Also, clean water. Nature filters and cleans our water for us, and so it's important to keep nature nice and healthy. Wetlands naturally filter water. We're going to learn more about that when we talk about water, but there's little tiny critters in there that eat all the nasties out of the water and help keep it nice and healthy. It provides us with fuel, okay, all types of things that we can use for fuel out in nature for burning, heating our homes, eating our food, powering our cars. You know, you got wood, you've got peat, all these different types of things. Wood and fiber, we use wood to build houses, so trees, all these different kinds of trees, and different types of wood are used for different things. Some are more flexible than others, so you use the non-flexible ones for your major core of the house, whereas the real pretty ones that are more flexible used for furniture or whatnot. Fiber from animals, wool, we're using that to weave into clothes that helps protect us, keep us nice and warm because we are not covered in fur like most animals. Minerals and metals, we use a lot of these for jewelry, for decorating, for making things, so nature provides us with those. Medicine, we talked about that. Genetic material, back to that agriculture, pulling in that genetic diverse material, putting it back in our domesticated breeds to help keep our things, all our agriculture and our animals healthy. Regulating services. These include things like water filtration and purification. Okay, so here in the valley, our water comes from an aquifer, which is an underground water storage area. And as water percolates down through our sand and through our soil and goes into that aquifer, it is getting cleaned out by all the little critters living in the soil and all the natural magnetic minerals in there that pull out all the nasty stuff. So it's really important to keep that very healthy. In a forest ecosystem, there's all different bacteria and things as water filters down through all the roots that cleans it out. There's a story about how in New York they destroyed a wetland, and that wetland was purifying the water in New York, and they started running out of nice clean water, and they realized the mistake they had made, and they spent millions of dollars restoring the wetlands because they needed that water filtration and purification service that nature was providing for them. Climate regulation and air quality, okay? As we have storms blow through, I don't know how many of you realize this, but last week when we had that big rainstorm come through, that cleaned out our air a lot. Having that rain and having clouds come through, it cleans out the air. Also regulates temperature, so that's very important. Nutrient cycling. We've talked about nutrient cycling. Nitrogen, carbon, all these things are really important. If we didn't have legumes and decomposers to continue with this cycling, we wouldn't be able to get those nutrients to flow around as they would and should, and wouldn't be available for living plants. Soil formation, more importantly, fertile soil. Again, those decomposers, all those little guys, very important for getting those nutrients back in the soil, giving us fertile soil so we can grow our crops, so we can have healthy plants that cleaning our air from carbon dioxide, giving us oxygen. All of this, very important services nature does. Disease and pest control. There are species out there, particularly reptiles, snakes and all that, owls. These guys are great pest control. They take a lot of those rodents out. The varmints, mice, rats, and these guys are really good disease vectors. Also squirrels. Okay, the Black Plague over in Europe, that came about because of rats. So those guys can carry out disease, but if there were plenty of owls and snakes around, the rats wouldn't have gotten out of control and they would have kept everything healthy and maybe the Black Plague wouldn't have happened. So important to keep those guys around. And pollination is a big one. Bees, bats, moths, all kinds of insects and other animals pollinate our crops. Without the process of pollination, we would have some really hard time keeping food growing. We cannot hand pollinate everything, and some plants don't even allow hand pollination. They won't respond to that, so that's very important. Storm and flood protection, another big one. Hurricane Katrina down there in Louisiana. I mean, we had that huge storm surge come in and flood that whole area out. Well, they found out what happened was they had actually built out over the wetland area. They had built up the soil and built on that area, and that wetland area was actually a storm surge protector. If we hadn't built houses out on there, that was nature's way of dealing with the storm. That was, Mother Nature said, this is kind of so for those occasional storms that will come in. If they hadn't had houses back there, they wouldn't have had nearly the problems they did, and if they hadn't built over those wetlands, they would have done their job in protecting. So lots of important stuff there. Come on, PowerPoint. Oh, cultural services, aesthetic, recreational, spiritual. We've kind of gone over some of that. So lots of different things going on there. In your PowerPoint, take a few minutes to read through this. It basically talks about the price of ecosystem services, and they've recently done this thing where they have put up a price tag on certain services to allow people to really understand how important it is. So you can read through that, click on the link, take a look at that on your own time there. Okay, so those first 5 reasons of why we protect biodiversity, we've got agricultural, pharmaceutical, recreational, aesthetic, and ecosystem services. Those 5 that we've gone over already, those are pretty easy to make a case for protecting biodiversity because they all say, cha-ching, you can put a price tag on every single one of those. The last one is called intrinsic value, and this one is pretty tough to make a case for. If you're arguing about protecting biodiversity to someone, say there's a swamp next door and all your neighbors want to build over it, but you want to keep it, and if you choose to go and argue for intrinsic value, you're probably not going to win your case. The idea with intrinsic value is that there is a value in everything that's here on Earth for its own sake. We might not understand its importance. We might not know why it's here on Earth, but it's here, and because it's here, it deserves to be protected. That's the idea with intrinsic value. Value in and of its own self. So you can see there, even the stinkiest bacteria at the bottom of a swamp, it's valuable and worth protecting simply for the fact that it exists. We may not understand why it exists, but it exists and we should protect it. So there's more information there. You can read about intrinsic value, but again, this one is a difficult one. It's basically a moral issue. Do you protect it if you don't know, well, all that bacteria does is stink. I mean, what do we care? Let's just get rid of that swamp, build over it, and make some money. Well, you never know what role it plays. I mean, we talked about systems, how complex they are. Maybe if you get rid of that bacteria, it was a major decomposer and cycling nutrients, and all of a sudden you're going to have, some other big problem. So you never really know. But again, protecting animals and plants simply because they exist, not knowing what their value is, that's intrinsic value. All right, in our next video, we're actually going to discuss some of the threats to biodiversity.